corruption is worse than prostitution. The latter may endanger the morals of an individual, but the former invariably endangers the morals of the entire country. That's a quote I heard somewhere, and I like it because I think it's true. The corruption of an individual is one, and okay, there are some who may even debate about the moral corruption of prostitution, and I'm not going to get into that. But the corruption of an entire nation is what corruption does. The moral decay of an entire nation. And I think a lot of what we see in Trinidad is invariably because of the corruption that has taken root across our country and at so many different levels in our country. Today, I am talking about crime because apparently there seems to be a surge in crime. Apparently means it's apparent to you. You can see it happening. It seems like something you can recognize. And that's what most Trinidadian citizens are finding apparent. It seems apparently in the last month or so, there has been a surge in crime, in particular the murders. But the police service has come out recently to let us know that what seems apparent to us is untrue. There has not been a surge in crime. There's no spike in crime according to the police service. You know, that's one of my most hated statements from the police service. In Trinidad and Tobago, that's a common thing. It has been happening. I am 30 years old, and it has been happening for as long as I've been paying attention to some news and hearing what commissioners say about the crime situation. Very regularly you would hear people are complaining and lamenting about the crime and the spike in crime, and commissioners going and coming have almost always said there's no real increase in the violent crime in Trinidad. There isn't a spike. If I had the time right now, at some point in time I may do that. Go through and see how many commissioners, how many quotes I could get from former commissioners in Trinidad and Tobago that have been saying crime has not actually been on the rise. There hasn't been an increase in crime. And they've been saying that year in, year out. But this year, compared to 30 years ago, most people would legitimately say there is some increase in crime. And I think even if you could place some technicality with the statistics to say violent crime hasn't increased because we categorize this wide variety of things as being violent crime, and though murders may be on the increase and robberies may be on the increase, there's this one significant violent crime that has decreased. So overall violent crime is staying about level. That's playing games with people, and especially when it comes to things like people's safety and security. That's not a game to play. If I am finding that I am seeing more murders happening around me, more people are dying, and for obvious reasons, this is something that us humans who have but one chance to live, this is something we pay particular attention to. When people around us are clocking out of that single one chance to live at higher rates, it tends to get people worried. And that's what seems to be happening around our country. And we could be wondering about what is the reason? What is the cause behind this? Why is serious crime on the rise? And I'm going to go through some articles that seem to suggest some reasons. I don't think anything has one simple reason, and especially when it comes to political landscapes and political statements. If you're trying to think about one simple reason, that's one sure way to be tricked by some politician. There usually isn't one overarching reason that if one person just does this one thing, everyone would be fine. There usually isn't anything like that. But let's go through some of the various reasons, and we'd be starting off with one of the most obvious reasons in a country with our kind of political climate. Political reasons. Each politician likes to blame whichever politician is in governance right now. The opposition almost always likes to blame them for the crime situation. And it's an easy blame to happen because crime always occurs. Crime hurts people. People don't feel good about the crime. And if you could convince people that the reason, one of the worst things that could happen in your present society, an increase in criminality, the reason that is happening is because of those at the top there. If you can convince them of that, maybe they'd vote for you next time. But here's the problem with that. If you convince them that high crime is the fault of the governing body, whoever they may be, and you are not that person at this present moment. It's some other person right now. You convince the population they are in charge and they are at fault for the present crime situation. What's going to happen if you get in charge next? And Dr. Rowley, our present Prime Minister, is facing some of that, because it was back in 2012 when Dr. Rowley was the opposition leader. He was quoted as saying, if the government can't deal with it, and he was speaking about crime, then the government itself is a part of the problem. He said those words, Dr. Rowley, our present Prime Minister. So, by his own confession, if his government cannot deal with the crime situation, then they are part of the problem. And back then, a lot of this conversation was happening because they had a particular spike in crime during that time period between the 2010 to 2015 partnership government. And how they dealt with it was they instituted a state of emergency and attempted to get a hold on the crime situation through those measures. And the opposition at the time, which was the People's National Movement, the present government, at the time they had a lot of criticisms for that government and the way they used that state of emergency, and also the fact that it seemed crime still wasn't handled even though they had a state of emergency and all that power to do so. Now, we are presently in a state of emergency, and we've been in a state of emergency for quite some time now. We've been under lockdown for quite some time now. And even with that state of emergency and lockdown, for this present government to still not be able to get a handle on crime, again, according to the Prime Minister's own confession, then this government can be called, according to him, part of the problem. And if you are part of my criminal problem, shouldn't I be getting rid of you? I mean, I'm using the Prime Minister's own reasoning here. Alright, so if you haven't tapped that like button, touch that like button, smash that like button, click that like button, however you do it, please do that and make sure it's selected. It allows the videos to reach out to a further audience. Also, commenting does that. It gives it a boost in that algorithm on YouTube. But it also tells me what you think about the content. What do you think about my opinions on it? Does it seem like it makes sense to you? Doesn't it? Does it not make sense to you? Drop a comment and tell me. So, we're going into an article on the news, in the Newsday. Charles, Hines overseas during murder hike. Hines, I am right here doing my work. Naparima MP Rodney Charles hit the government on Sunday for Minister of National Security Fitzgerald Hines going abroad at a time when there is a spike in murders and the police commissioner post is still vacant. However, Hines spoke to Newsday later on Sunday to say he was very much in the country and was diligently doing his work after returning from an overseas trip. He said the trip was for 6 days, in which he was mandated to represent the government at a very important handing over ceremony for the US Southern Command. Now, as we go through this article, several things that we take for granted in modern times, how we run our government, could be a bit questionable to me in certain senses. As in, some of the frivolities we allow people who are really just managers for us to go on with, I could have some questions for that. But on the other side, what exactly is the Minister of National Security supposed to do directly about the crime situation? The crime situation is within the purview or the remit of the police service. They are the ones charged with the law enforcement and decreasing and handling crime around the country. The Minister of National Security has an overseer, a managerial portfolio over this national security business. He doesn't have a micromanager's kind of job. He isn't in charge of sending parties and groups out to specific areas to deal with something and writing up operations. In fact, we do not want him to do that. If he does do too much of that, we'd say there's political interference in the carrying out of law enforcement in our country. So, some of that criticism, I don't even fully understand. I think the criticism itself needs to be a bit more specific. Okay, he's out of the country while we're in a crime spiked situation. So, as the opposition now, what would you have done, or what would you suggest that he does in this present situation to alleviate some of this spike in crime? What are you suggesting? Just that his very presence in the country is going to somehow manage this situation? I'm not sure, and it doesn't quite make sense to me. Hines also rubbished Charles' claims that this trip was a Christmas shopping one, as he said that in addition to the handing over ceremony, he also met with US State Department officials for talks incorporating to tackle transnational organized crime, climate change, and cyber security. Now, two of those things, organized crime and cyber security, are very, very, very important parts within the portfolio of the National Security Minister. And climate change is a very, very important thing on the entire portfolio of every minister, of every government around the entire world, because that's the importance it's being pushed with right now. I do agree the climate is changing and steps must be made in order to alleviate some of these, but a lot of the steps that we are looking to make with some of these leaders don't really make sense to me. And it seems like, again, as I said in my contemplation on this, like some of the axes are meeting together to discuss how best to conserve the forest. Some of the people who have caused the greatest parts of some of these problems are the people now talking that they would be the leaders and tell us, the populations, who, if we check our global carbon footprint, it may be a bird's footprint while theirs may be a gorilla's or King Kong's footprint. And they're telling us how to further reduce our footprint so that theirs could continue as is. At least some of how a lot of it sounds. Anyway, that's on climate change. We're talking Trinidad crime now. The opposition MP Rodney Charles went on to say the 51 murders this month are an indictment on the incompetence, cluelessness, and ineptitude of Fitzgerald Hines, who seems assured that an acquired Oxford accent will disguise the fact that he is ill-suited by qualifications, experience, or track record for the job of Minister of National Security. As far as I know, someone out there could correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Fitzgerald Hines at one point in time a police officer? And he's presently a lawyer? I think those two qualifications seem in line with being a Minister of National Security. At least to me, it seems like something you'd want in someone in charge of the Ministry of National Security. But that's what the opposition MP said. And he went on further down to say something is amiss, and Hines prioritizes a one-week change of command ceremony in Miami while criminals run amok and our police service is essentially rudderless. He said the business of policing is at a standstill with no commissioner of police being appointed and no deputy commissioner at the helm. No firearm users' licenses can be granted. None. Hundreds of promotions are being held up. No disciplinary actions for 99.9% of police officers can be finalized. And Hines in Miami eating shrimps. Charles asked if criminals were being emboldened by the administrative weaknesses in the police service. Is the escalating crime spree in October because we have no commissioner of police and only one deputy commissioner of police, and the police service is essentially rudderless? Now, that part of his questioning, I can agree, and I could understand. I listen to some talk shows on mornings and afternoons too, and I've heard some people calling and talk, and I've heard the topic of the commissioner come up, and I've heard numerous people speak as though a commissioner isn't very important, and they've said things like the police service has no real negative impact from this loss of a commissioner and this lack of a commissioner. And I'm wondering, if the case is the police service has no real negative impact by not having a commissioner, then why do we have a commissioner in the first place? Why pay this person? Because we do pay commissioners well. It's best we do away with this whole portfolio. And if the case is, though, on the other hand, that it is so important to choose the right commissioner, that people are willing to have clandestine meetings in the back room of our president's house to make sure the right one is chosen or not chosen, then this portfolio is very important. And the crime situation that we are seeing presently, where apparently we are seeing some increase in criminality, I'd say it's a hard argument to argue to me that there's no correlation and no causation between lack of commissioner and some higher criminality in the country. And you know who agrees with me? You wouldn't believe who agrees with me. Or you may already know who agrees with me. Former Commissioner Griffith, murder spike linked to my absence. Former Police Commissioner Gary Griffith is denying the police's claim that there was no spike in murders over the last few weeks. In a media release on Wednesday, the police said they were making it categorically clear that recent isolated reports of murders in some communities do not represent a surge in murders as being reported. Now, I'd argue that according to the last article, the number was 51 murders, was it? Someone could clarify that and confirm that if you've heard a different number. But 51 murders in a month doesn't really seem like isolated reports of murders in some communities and not representing a surge. That sounds like a surge to me. 51 murders. That's 51 people. That's a number of people you'd notice. That's more than an entire secondary school classroom. That's quite a few people. That's 2 bus loads of people. So I'd say the kind of trying to make this seem like it's not a significant number wouldn't work for the police service. The police service release did not specify where the surge in murders was being reported. Commenters on social media have linked Gary Griffith's absence from the police commissioner's seat to the increase in murders. In a social media post on Sunday, Griffith pointed out that before his departure in September, there were fewer murders committed as compared to the same period last year. He added that for the first 7 months of this year, there were 50 fewer murders than 2020. In the 10 weeks or so since my contract ended, there have been 55 more murders for the same period than there were last year. 55 more. Now, I'm hoping he's quoting these numbers correctly. In 10 weeks, there have been 55 more murders for the same period than there were last year. 55 more. That's not 55 total. That's 55. There's this number here and 55 more within 10 weeks of his departure as commissioner. Now, with men like Griffith, sometimes I wonder. One of my favorite shows in my years when it showed was House MD, where Dr. Gregory House was a doctor, a genius of a doctor, but quite a jerk. And I enjoyed how the show positioned it, where he was a jerk, he was annoying, he was aggravating, he was legitimately in some cases a mean person, but he was often right, and he was usually more right than the people he was being jerks to. And sometimes I could wonder about people even like Griffith, if he does have an argument about his competence. And for the people who do not like his attitude and how he does what he does, if he is competent at what he is doing, that may make things all the more complicated. If the case is, you tell me, you drop a comment and tell me, if the case is that Griffith's attitude, if you are someone who really doesn't like how he acts and how he behaves, do you think if he is the most competent candidate presently for the post of police commissioner, that you could bypass those personality quirks? And if the case is numerically he is bringing down violent crime in the country, would you overlook those personality quirks for that? Drop that in the comments and tell me. Griffith went on to say, if there were 200 fewer murders in the second half of my contract and 55 more than the previous year, I've not been there. Isn't that a spike? And okay, legitimate question. I'd like to see the police answer. The police media release said for this year, 72 people were charged with murder, while the murder toll up to last Wednesday was on par with last year's figures of 340. In 2019, there were 439 murders. Newsday requested the monthly murder toll from August to October from 2020 and 2021 last Wednesday, and is still waiting a response from the police. And If they get those numbers, I think those numbers are the best to compare, I think. But the commissioner is already saying there's a 55 more murders already. And he is saying that. I'd hope that the newspaper could confirm that with the police service at some point in time. Griffith went on, there are 55 more murders for the last 10 weeks, but we are still battling COVID-19. We still have lockdowns and we still have a curfew. How could those conditions be responsible for the low numbers in the last half of my contract, the previous 18 months, but not in the last 10 weeks? Shouldn't the numbers have continued to go down like they did for the first part of the year? And that is true. If the lockdown and the COVID and the curfew is what allowed the numbers to decrease previously, then we are still supposed to be seeing that downward trend, I'd suppose. And I suppose Griffith would suppose that also. Griffith added that while there was a decrease in murders in Titi, Trinidad, during his tenure with the pandemic, there were increases in major cities in the United States, which also had lockdowns and other restrictions on movement to battle the pandemic. This increase in crime in major cities like New York, Chicago, and LA, and right here in the last 10 weeks involved criminals who didn't get the memo that during COVID-19 crime is supposed to be reduced. And that is true. The US currently is having, I believe, a 30-year crime spike. A lot of it is being linked politically to some of those who were clamoring to defund the police in some of those major cities last year, and some of the defunding happened, and let it be known, even if you are someone for social justice, you care about the crimes of the police and you want to see the police prosecuted, let it be known that statistically it is already a pretty sure fact that decreasing the number and presence of police increases the rate of crime. Okay? But Griffith does have a point there. If the cases that we have seen in places where there were lockdowns, there were curfews, there were state of emergencies, but those places still continued to have a rise in crime, or particularly had a spike in crime, then we can't just say that the decrease in crime in Trinidad and Tobago over the last 2 years would have been solely because of the pandemic. And he also has a point that since he has left, there does seem to be that increasing trend. As for the reason why our country sees so much crime and the reason why these things spike, we have the police service, that's one. We have the government officials, that's one. But I think the common factor between those two things that causes that surge in crime that we see, that causes the difficulty in criminality that we see in Trinidad and Tobago, is the corruption that pervades the society, from the government official level to the law enforcement level to the regular citizenry level. When people go on paying and bribing for something as simple as a driver's license, and you're bribing someone who is of sorts a law enforcement agency in our country, you are encouraging corruption within the law enforcement agency. So we have the encouragement for corruption in those law enforcement agencies coming from the citizenry. And then when you have corrupt government officials who have to get away with millions disappearing, they can't have a police service that is working too efficiently. So we have the corruption of the law enforcement agencies from the top. So we have pressures to corrupt these law enforcement agencies from the top and from the bottom. So what do we expect but corruption to come out of it? An article in the Newsday that I think points to some of that and just signals some of that. It doesn't deal directly with the surge we're seeing presently in crime, but I think it leans pretty well into understanding the fuller picture with this. Immigration officer charged with possession of forged documents. A 38-year-old Charleville immigration officer has been charged with possession of a forged document after he was allegedly held with a bogus immigration stamp. I think this one didn't have much editing done in the article. And an immigration officer caught with documents and equipment that seemed to suggest his intention was to forge the immigration process. And do you think this is an isolated incident where the person in charge of looking over and making sure this aspect of our country runs efficiently is exactly the person who is bypassing the security of that area. The monsters inside the building. You know those horrors where eventually they've locked the doors and they're looking out the windows looking to see what monster is coming for them, and it turns out the monster is inside the building. It's coming from inside. What do you think? Where do you think our crime situation stems from? Is it one simple solution, or is it spread out across habits and cultures that we have built and inculcated in our nation over maybe a century? Drop a comment, let me know. That's all I have for now. I hope you are educated, informed, or entertained, and drop that like. Make sure you click that like button and comment if you want to, and subscribe if you haven't yet subscribed, and stay tuned. I'll be with you in the next video.
Feel the music, rising with the time.